So I do what I call the 4 Lacanian takes to rethink the trans experience. It is a common assumption that when individuals move beyond the physical confines of their assigned gender, they are navigating a gender boundary. However, my experience as a psychoanalyst working with trans-identified analysans has taught me that the real boundary in question is not one of gender, but rather an engagement with another frontier, the confrontation with death itself, which ultimately paves the way for life. The English word border, as we understand it today, a demarcation of geographical boundaries or a borderland, finds its origins in the 14th century. It evolved from bordure, a term rooted in heraldry, that denoted the color or strip framing a shield. This etymology sent us back to the Old French bordure, signifying the seam or edge of a shield, what one might poetically call its border. Intriguingly, the term's reach extended beyond the battlefield, gracing the ornamental rims of plates and garments alike. What if a body itself was a border, a boundary, a seam, an ornamental rim along the edge of our being? I will move away from the borders one needs a passport to cross legally to other borders situated closer to the body, or better still, borders that would constitute it, hence a body marked by class, race, ethnicity, nationality, and transnational movements. However, the body is juridically confined by identification documents, requires for visas and passports, and they almost invariably have a gender marker. In everyday vernacular, the English vernacular, the word gender is often used to determine whether we identify as male or female or something else entirely. It is understood to encompass a vast range of identitary possibilities reflecting an evolving conviction about oneself. The issues surrounding sexual identity center on the experience of a particular body, not one into which one is born, but one that one comes to embody. Gender as a verb implies an active process to divide, to bring forth, to give birth, to generate, representing something that one becomes. Here, I take as my model Lacan's 1964 seminar in which he presented 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis: the unconscious, repetition, the transference, and the drive. In a similar manner, I want to reflect on some key concepts that underpin my clinical work as a psychoanalyst with trans-identified analysis. I discovered that I needed 4 terms that expand Lacan's central insights. The first one is that of realness. It develops Lacan's notion of the real as not identical with reality. Realness is often used by trans persons to describe the authenticity of their gender performance, for it is a supreme truth beyond any verification. The second concept is the concept of beauty in the context of the paranoia of Judge Schreber, a case discussed both by Freud and Lacan. Beauty will be understood in connection with plasticity as developed by Catherine Malabou. The third concept is that of laughter, a laughter that can be about nothing, as introduced by Democritus and discussed by Barbara Cassan, Alain Badiou, and Madeleine Dollard. Lacan famously identified the nothing as one of the objects of psychoanalysis. I push the analysis to the point where one can understand a wish to not being, as found in suicide, as leading to the goal of being again. The Meden was a notion deployed by Barbara Kazan in her book Lacan the Sophist and in discussion with Alain Badiou. And finally, the last concept is that of the swirl or turbulence or clinamen in the atomic philosophy of Lucretius and its echoes in contemporary discourse. As an ontological swirl, turbulence throws new light on the role of accidents and accounts for how accidents can turn into destiny, touquet. The classical concepts of the clinamen and turbulence have been explored systematically by Michel Serres. This turbulence echoes with Lacan's notion of the symptom, is a symptom that does not need to be cured, but leads to a recreation of oneself that makes life livable. This new book aims at providing a theoretical grounding for some of the claims I make in my book, Transgender Psychoanalysis, and are taken together to work as 4 clusters of concepts to provide a foundation for my thinking about psychoanalysis, especially in an effort to rethink Lacan's difficult and shifting notion of the real as it pertains to my awareness of the endless transformations of the body defined by plasticity and the death drive. My first question, and is betrayed by the title Bodies to Wear, is what is the role of the body in psychoanalysis? I gave you the example of Freud being advised wisely by an analysand not to have bodily contact. So what is the role, the function of psychoanalysis in relation to the body? How do we take body in psychoanalysis? As we know, the treatment's famously demands no bodily contact, yet its efficacy relies on the corporeal presence of 2 individuals in a shared room. One reclined on a couch, the other out of sight, settled in a large armchair. This setup, a cornerstone of analytic practice, has seen its certainties shaken in recent years. The pandemic normalized remote treatment, and many of us, I may recall for those who are, I don't know how many in the room are practitioners, suddenly 2020 we all became flat, one-dimensional, two-dimensional with good lighting beings, and we were in many Zoom meetings reduced to little stamps to fulfill any philatelic aspirations. We were all reduced to little rectangles. So even today, whether or not to see patients in person remains a point of contention among psychoanalysts. Some have abandoned their offices altogether and now interact with patients using exclusively a virtual approach via screens or even telephones. Others, like myself, continue to find value in the physical encounter, preferring to meet analysands in the flesh whenever possible, while embracing also living in an ever-changing medium of online work. The debate underscores a larger and ongoing inquiry. What does it mean to inhabit a body, and how does its absence or mediated presence alter the analytic process? As we all know, psychoanalysis was born of what we may call body trouble. The strange ailments of hysteria map out an anatomy both wild and imaginary, more faithful to language than to biology. For example, a single thought, I cannot see this, could make someone blind. This classical etiology of hysteria needs to be re-examined because it marked the beginning of my own career. My barrio patients will report a vivid and unsettling bodily situation, strange symptoms. One case stands out. A young man of 22, seemingly without warning, became acutely disturbed. He suddenly engaged in a frenetic activity, running about the room, waving his arms while shouting incoherently. His agitated behavior escalated to such a degree that physical restraint became necessary. As he was subdued, his condition worsened, his body stiffened, his breathing grew labored, and his eyes rolled upward, leaving only the whites visible. Foam gathered at his mouth, his breathing labored, then the tremors coursing through his body, and his body became a rigid frame. The intensity of the episode necessitated immediate medical intervention. An ambulance was called. During his subsequent hospitalizations, while no organic cause was detected, he experienced several similar milder episodes. He experienced what was then labeled as a Puerto Rican syndrome, sort of classical return of the most canonical form of hysteria, one that I thought was only going to be found in all histories of psychiatry. This is how I encounter in my practice in the barrio a wonderful point of coincidence between clearly racist invention. Still in the Bible of Diagnosis, the DSM, you have a section called cultural bound syndromes, and the ataque de nervios is there, but they say that it only happens in the United States, in southern states, and in the rest of the world, in those poor countries that are more prone to hysteric manifestations. It was impossible for me not to, facing this type of symptoms, to have to think of the body problematizing clinical manifestations, also taking into account a political traversal. And it's something that's still pertinent. As I argued in the Puerto Rican Syndrome, it's a book that dates back to 2003, that you cannot look at isolated symptoms. We need to look and reframe what we describe as pathologies, taking into account systemic oppression, migration, marginalization, but also the element of creativity, how analysands find spontaneous ways of a cure, that is Puerto Rican syndrome episodes, as at times very debilitating as they may be, were also functioning as form of political protest. So I will now stop there from reading to the text to maybe go to other perhaps forms of expression that could also be political, but maybe in disguise. And I will go into a sartorial discussion. I will talk about body dressing. Dress serves as a pivotal element of embodiment. From dressing up to dressing down, fashions and costumes make the body presentable, shaping identity. Fashion carries profound importance for members of the transgender community, extending far beyond mere material items such as clothing or footwear. It represents the pivotal first step in harmonizing their external presentation with their identity. For Sofia Hernandez, a 27-year-old trans woman, sartorial choices were transformative. I quote her. When I first wore a skirt, it was the most life-changing thing ever, a catalyst to who I am today, she reflects. Quote, fashion became a tool for curating the life I wanted and taking that leap to transition, end quote. Corey Wright, a 28-year-old model, speaker, and activist from Los Angeles in the US, shares a similar narrative of exploration through fashion. Initially opting for oversized, shape-concealing garments, Ray found her authentic style after gender-confirming surgery. During her second year in college, and I quote from Ray, my style shift from hiding a body I was uncomfortable with to celebrating a body I'm proud of, end quote. Ray eventually cultivated an aesthetic that resonated with her true self, stating, quote, "Now I can express who really I am through fashion," end quote. For both Ray and Hernandez, clothing emerged as a vital means to explore their identities, liberating them from external expectations. Fashion empowered them to articulate their identities in their own terms, offering the freedom to explore a myriad of styles and aesthetics until they discover what truly resonated. There I will maybe move to a meditation. It's an exploration that I did with another of the authors of this series, Jameson Webster. We worked together on fashion. We wanted to find out what was fashion about, and we were inspired by Freud's text on transience, because nothing goes out of fashion as quickly as fashionable items. So we wanted to, for us, that was an important element, and we were thinking, will psychoanalysis also go out of fashion? Hopefully. We will then move on to maybe some more interesting things. But in the meanwhile, we wanted to see whether or not psychoanalysis could say something about fashion. So we took as point of departure not only Freud, but also Walter Benjamin's meditation on fashion as being the eternal recurrence of the new. Benjamin proposed the idea that fashion mediates the rapport between our need for consumption of novelties and, quite simply, death. With Jameson Webster, we explored the ways that fashion objects cover over death, while simultaneously expressing it, needing to find new forms to regenerate desire and perhaps renewing an engagement with life. We call it dressing up the death drive. If trans analysts experience gender trouble, as Judith Butler puts it, and resolve the trouble, finding themselves in a trans identity, I propose a movement from death to life, which would make us consider death more as a life force, a force that allows for a rebirth. Clinical work, again, opens a path towards figuring out how to live with the death drive while paradoxically rendering life possible. Here, death emerged not as the opposite of life, but rather as a condition for life. And I will insist on this issue of death based on my experience with self-identified trans analysans, for whom the key issue is less gender fluidity than being able to fashion a way of being, a way of existing. And here I take the instance of, often in the American doxa, the trans experience is presented as a lifestyle choice. You move to the suburbs, you give up smoking, you become vegetarian. But it's a consumeristic choice, where I think it's, even though the journey may begin with the body, we may say that the body is the only realm we cannot escape. We are all confined to existing in our mortal bodies. But maybe to conclude, and maybe to perhaps open the discussion, because this was a conversation we were having with Jordan it's a special issue for psychoanalytic audience, I believe, if you can tell us. An IPA, okay. Ooh, we are not preaching to the choir, definitely. Okay, the real guys. So that we wonder why is there such and like you may be aware of the recent presidential decree. Why doesn't a president need to declare that there are only two genders, he said, interestingly enough, and sign a decree that there are only two genders and they have to overlap with those declared at birth and supposedly follow the truth inscribed in the flesh. And it's interesting that Trump didn't say sexist, even though he was supposedly based on a truth found in anatomy. But one of the interesting things that perhaps we could open for the discussion, that the trans experience is being attacked currently in the context more virulently in the US, but I think in England, unhappily, you're not too far behind in terms of reactionary measures that really make trans experience even more precarious. It's as if the trans embodiment would function for someone who identifies as cis as questioning their own identities. That's if someone could embody an identity that is defined as trans, their cis identity would become even more precarious. And maybe to try to explore our current moment, where I could maybe open to your questions, and I leave you maybe with the taste and hoping that you'll be tempted to continue reading it's a ready-to-wear book. Even if it's less than 100 grams, I think it will be very wearable. And maybe discuss, I'm very curious about how the experience is in right now in the US is a very you're just back from the U.S., Jordan. Is a little appalling, the situation where we are living in, and it's a little scary. And maybe reclaim the possibility of maybe different wearabilities of the body, and how maybe life in a non-normative body becomes more and more challenged by the oppressive political context.